Welcome to State of Mind. Being human and living well.
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 I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're going to be talking about dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. Dissociative identity disorder is now commonly referred to as DID and is often sensationalized and portrayed inaccurately in the media. While not a common psychiatric disorder, DID is not rare either and occurs in about 1.5% of the global population. Many people with DID have a history of severe childhood abuse, which may have caused them to dissociate from their bodies in order to cope with overwhelming trauma. Those with this condition often also experience self-injurious behavior, suicide attempts, and substance abuse problems. Dissociative identity disorder is frequently misdiagnosed and often requires multiple assessments for an accurate diagnosis to be made. Diagnosis is also slow to come, with patients frequently spending 5 to 12.5 years in treatment before getting accurately diagnosed. DID is one of the most misunderstood psychiatric disorders, and so in today's program, we're hoping to spread greater understanding and address common misconceptions about it. We'll also discuss a unique treatment approach called internal family systems, or IFS, which can be particularly helpful to those with this condition. Joining us for this conversation are Clay Whitten, who's lived in Santa Cruz for 6 years. While Clay has struggled with PTSD symptoms and dissociation for a large portion of their life, they were diagnosed with DID in 2021 while attending a residential treatment program for their trauma and disordered eating. Since getting this diagnosis, Clay has been able to have a language to express and understand better what's going on for them. They hope that by sharing their story and experience, they can help reduce the stigma associated with this condition, share what it's like to have DID, and maybe help others who can relate to their story. Also with us is Dr. Alisa Brady, a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 20 years of experience in healthcare. She's one of the founders of Wings Recovery, an intensive mental health treatment facility that focuses on the treatment of complex trauma. Dr. Brady is an EMDR-trained clinician and currently leads a team of clinicians who work to help treat individuals with PTSD, complex trauma, and dissociation. Welcome to State of Mind, Dr. Brady and Clay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Happy to be here.
Well, Alisa, I want to begin with you. Can you define and describe and maybe give some examples of what dissociative identity disorder is and how someone might experience it?
Yeah. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, used to be known as multiple personality disorder. And essentially, it's a condition in which parts of the self or personality become cut off or kind of oftentimes out of awareness from other parts of the self. And so there becomes kind of identity fragments. Oftentimes, there's also dissociative amnesia that occurs with it, where if the person can, what we would say, switch into another part of themselves, they may lose memory or time for that part. And it really evolves out of oftentimes early and severe childhood trauma, in which there's dissociation that happened at the time of trauma. And the dissociation is really a way of the brain protecting ourselves from the trauma that's happening in that moment. So it's called DID. It can present in many different ways, and it often takes quite a while to get a true diagnosis of DID.
So you said it often occurs from childhood trauma, but not always? Are there other?
Yeah, it does, but the type of trauma may vary, and it's different for different individuals. And there's some research that some individuals may be more prone, like even genetically more prone to dissociate than others. But the type of trauma can vary, whether it's sexual, physical, emotional, or all three. There are also some research research to suggest that the earlier that the trauma occurs, the more likely the individual is to dissociate.
And are there specific risk factors that can contribute to the likelihood someone could develop DID or dissociative identity disorder?
I think it's really chronic and severe early childhood abuse of some form or another.
If someone had a friend or a loved one who might be experiencing DID, what might you see in that person's behaviors or affect?
It may be really obvious, or it may not be really obvious to an outside observer. I think people often imagine that the presentation of DID is going to be very dramatic or extreme, but that's not always the case, at least in my experience in working with individuals, that it's not necessarily an extreme change in personality all the time. So it may not be super obvious. But if you're close to that individual, you may notice that they may have lost periods of time and may not remember things that have happened. And I'm not talking losing time as a result of substance use or anything like that. You may notice that they've lost time. You may notice that they present differently. They may even refer to themselves differently. And so those, even knowing someone closely, it can take a while to fully understand what's happening for that other individual.
Perhaps that's part of the reason, the challenge of diagnosis and why it can take so long.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So Clay reached out to me to suggest we do this episode on dissociative identity disorder. And as soon as I started talking with them about it, I knew that we needed to do the show to help broaden understanding about this often misunderstood diagnosis and experience. So Clay, when did your symptoms begin and what were they like early on?
Yeah, so I started going to therapy when I was about 23 years old. And my first year of therapy, I was totally silent and didn't say anything. And then as I built trust with my therapist, I started having flashes of memories and body memories of abuse that I had like thoroughly buried inside. And that's when I first remember having dissociative episodes. I'm not sure if I had any before that, but mostly at the beginning, it looked like me becoming super nonverbal, and I would have this really intense physical reaction inside my body, and I would often like hide underneath the desk or in the corner of the room and just cry, totally unable to talk. And I remember coming out of therapy sessions sort of in this daze, like kind of shell shocked. And I would just sit in my car for I don't even know how long, just sort of staring into space, trying to understand what just happened and trying to kind of understand what was going on inside of me. And it was really hard. But I think my DID was not fully diagnosed until a lot later, like 8 years later, because my parts tend to be pretty shy, and I have a lot of trust issues, and so it really takes feeling trusting and building a connective relationship before my parts felt safe enough to come out.
And how did you see those symptoms changing for you over time?
Yeah, so it used to be just extremely nonverbal. And then after doing some more like craniosacral and somatic work, I started to have more access.
I'm just going to pause you for a minute. Can you define for our listeners what that is? Because they might not be familiar with that.
Sure. Yeah, craniosacral is a technique that incorporates the body with what's going on in the mind. And somatic work is similar, but in a different sort of strategy. But both are attempting to heal both the mind and body, and like using that connection to to help with recovery. So it wasn't really until I had a therapist incorporate my body that I was able to talk more. And for me, dissociation is a very physical experience. Like my heart races and I usually get like pretty hot and sweaty. And there's a different part of my body that like generally has a lot of energy, whether it's like my legs shaking or patting, like tapping my leg, or I have one part that like snaps a lot for any. So I kind of know what part's out based on what my body is doing. Um, but yeah, so it was a lot of nonverbal responses at the beginning. And then after I built trust with a particular therapist, that's when the parts started making themselves more known. And yeah, I would kind of like slip into more distinctive personality states. There's always been this like sort of sliding back, kind of like it's like it started really slow in the beginning and now it happens like really fast. But I remember just feeling like I was losing control over my body and my like what I was saying, what I was doing. And at the beginning, I had a lot of judgment for myself. Like I didn't understand what was happening and I thought that I should have more control. And I didn't understand why I didn't have the control. It's sort of like sitting in the back seat of a car and like watching someone else drive it, even though I can say like I want you to turn right now, but whoever's in the driver's seat ultimately has the control over what's happening.
Wow. Is that frightening for you, or have you made some peace with that experience? Because I mean, some people don't even like to be in the passenger seat, let alone the back seat. What is that like for you?
It's pretty dependent on which part is out. When it's a really functional part, it's awesome. You know, like that part can be an incredible employee. That part can be super charismatic at parties and the life of the party. It's super funny and like that's awesome. But it can get pretty dark pretty fast. You know, going into like really intense, certain parts carry more intense body memories. So that can be really a terrifying experience. And then other parts have like really bad behavior that I wish they would learn better coping skills. But yeah, I have certain parts that are suicidal or certain parts that are tend to self-harm. And then I always have the fear inside of myself. I know that a lot of perpetrators or people that have experienced trauma themselves. So I have this like fear in the back of my mind that maybe I have a part that is also a perpetrator. And hopefully I have enough parts that want the total opposite of that, that it's not an issue. And it hasn't been an issue yet for me. The only person those parts have harmed is me. But I do always have that fear.
How did you try to deal with your DID symptoms on your own before you sought treatment? I mean, it sounds like maybe you didn't know they were happening before you sought treatment, that's when your awareness developed. But even before getting the diagnosis, like what were your attempts to sort of manage symptoms?
Yeah, so I developed two really strong coping mechanisms to help me, which was basically overworking, and over exercising. So working was really helpful because I could be in this version of myself I was proud of, and I could really focus my energy externally and cater to other people's needs and be a good employee and all of that. And then whenever I wasn't working, I exercised essentially because exercising really helped me be in my body. And I would choose particularly like rock climbing, which is can be really dangerous and requires you to be really focused on what you're doing. So it helped me to stay outside of, you know, not go inward and not deal with the horrible things that were happening in my head, and helped me to sort of avoid all of that. And it only worked for so long.
So it's my understanding that it can take a really long time for people to get diagnosed. And I'm wondering, Clay, were you in mental health treatment before you were diagnosed? And if so, for how long?
I was seeing an outpatient therapist for 7 years. And then it wasn't until I had some pretty extreme traumatic incidents happen that I kind of hit my breaking point. And that's when I first went to a residential trauma treatment center. And it was actually at that trauma treatment center that I met people for the first time that had DID. And I learned more about what that was and how it presented. And while I was there, I started to see it around me and kind of, that's actually when my parts first started making themselves known to me. And I sort of had this thought in the back of my mind that like maybe that's what was going on. But it wasn't until I went to an eating disorder center a few months after that that the parts really came out in a bigger way.
What, if anything, changed for you after you got accurately diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder?
I think the biggest change that happened for me was I had better language to understand what was occurring for me. And there's also, I think everyone has this where like when they're experiencing mental health symptoms, there's this judgment of like, am I crazy or is there something wrong with me? But having the diagnosis and understanding, like reading more to help me understand where it came from, helped me have a better acceptance of myself and the diagnosis. And I think diagnoses can be really helpful, but I think that they can be really damaging in a lot of ways. So I try not to like over identify or go into this rabbit hole of like, yeah, it can be unhelpful sometimes. But for me, getting the official diagnosis did help me understand more what was happening and get the right types of treatment for it.
It also provides sort of an avenue to start learning about what's going on for yourself. I find that often too, that, it is a tool that can help give you access to resources and information, and also give you a community of people that are having some kind of similar experience that frequently is very powerful for people. Were any of those things particularly meaningful for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to talk to other people with DID helped me like not feel alone and has helped me get some advice on how to move forward now that I know I have all these parts. And having like I'm working really hard on building more communication with my parts, and it can be super duper helpful to understand what their needs are or even start to like try and predict what their needs are so that they don't kind of come out in larger, more dramatic ways. If I'm meeting their needs, then they don't have to come out and maybe act in ways that I don't want them to.
You're listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID, which is one of the most misunderstood psychiatric conditions. Joining us for this conversation is Clay Whitten, who after years of mental health treatment was diagnosed with DID in 2021. Also with us is clinical psychologist and leader of Wings Recovery Trauma Treatment Program, Dr. Alisa Brady. Listeners of today's show may also want to check out episode 40 titled Trauma in the Central Nervous System. That and many other episodes can be found in our archives at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Back to our interview. So as we're coming back, Alisa, I understand there's something you want to ask.
Clay, I was just wondering, because you were talking a lot about the body memories and also about how tuning in with your body was a big part of you kind of understanding the diagnosis and understanding the parts of yourself better. And I wonder if the fact that it sounds like the body memories were a most prominent part of when you realized that this was going on for you. And I wonder if the reason it was more body memories for you is because of the age in which trauma happened. Like, I've noticed that sometimes if it happened pre-verbal, for example, or when someone's younger and they don't really have words to explain what's going on, that a lot of times that the trauma can present more significantly in the body. And I'm wondering if that's the case for you, or maybe not.
That's super interesting. I always kind of wondered about that, but I think the earliest memory I have, I think I was around 2, maybe a little younger. So that would make a lot of sense. My most extreme trauma was between the ages of 2 and 11.
So, Alisa, that's a good lead in. As you were listening to Clay's story, I'm wondering what stood out to you as really common with the patients that you treat, or did anything seem particularly unique about Clay's experience with dissociative identity disorder?
Well, I think everybody's experience is unique, and special and unique to them, and want to hold space for that. But I do notice that some of the things that you've talked about, I've heard other people talk about it as well. And I think one thing that stuck out to me was just also you mentioning a fear of the perpetrator part being there or acting. And I think what I've seen is with individuals that's really common, and that in the literature we would refer to that as a dissociative phobia, right? That there can be a phobic response to a fear that there could be a perpetrator part, or an internalized part of the perpetrator who may think like the perpetrator or treat you like the perpetrator, right? So if you think about even people who don't have DID, if they've been shamed or verbally abused, that oftentimes as an adult, you internalize those messages, right? You end up saying and talking to yourself in that same way. It's maybe a more extreme version of that. But I think that, when you spoke of that resonated with me, because I've seen other people struggle with that. And sometimes that's one of the hardest things to work on when it comes to working with the system, right? It is acknowledging that part or welcoming that part that seems so scary.
When you're talking about this, it makes me think that when I was preparing for this conversation and doing some reading, it seemed the literature said that people with DID are no more likely to be violent than any other person, and that's a common misconception that people that don't have the disorder have, but it sounds like you're thinking that even people that do have it might think about themselves. So as I talked with you about coming on the show, you also talked about how every person develops parts of themselves in response to situations and experiences. Alisa, can you describe what you mean by that and give some examples? And how might that differ in someone who has developed dissociative identity disorder?
Well, I think as human beings, we all have parts of ourselves, and that's normal, right? There's a part that may be more present in a work environment, a part that may be more present when you're functioning as a mom, or, when you're out with your friends, or under stress. Anyone can revert to a teenager, childlike part of themselves and can behave in that manner. That's really normal. That's part of the human condition. And I think what's a little bit different for people who experience dissociation or DID is that it's maybe a more extreme version of that. It's more fractured. There's oftentimes maybe less awareness of the parts of the self, and maybe a feeling of less control over those parts of the self. Clay was mentioning, that feeling of being in the back seat, of really feeling like they didn't have control over the part that was present in that moment. So it's maybe just a more extreme version of what everyone experiences to some extent, is that there are naturally parts of ourselves.
What do you think is important for listeners to understand about accurate diagnosis, and how and where could someone who's had early childhood trauma get appropriately evaluated?
I mean, I think that obviously it starts with a clinician who has experience in treating complex trauma and dissociation and getting an accurate diagnosis. Sometimes a diagnosis is important, and sometimes a diagnosis is not the most important part of the treatment. It's really just understanding about themselves and kind of working through what's coming up for them and understanding their system. And I think connecting it, when you can make the connection to trauma memories, then you can begin to really work on addressing and healing from those trauma memories.
You know, one place that I found diagnosis becomes important sometimes is in trying to access levels of care. And so I'm just wondering, you know, does the diagnosis become important if somebody needs certain levels of treatment or care? What would you say about that, Alisa, from your experience?
Well, it depends on who's authorizing that care. So if
I'm referring to insurance companies who often control access to care. Yeah.
right, okay, that's what I figured, and that's what I deal with. I'll say dealing with insurance is the worst part of my job and so stressful. And it can trigger a part in me that gets very angry and frustrated. But I would say from an insurance perspective, what I've seen is that the diagnosis can facilitate or help justify a higher level of care when it's needed. But unfortunately, the diagnosis in and of itself is not enough to justify like a residential level of care. I think it really has to do with the risk to safety. Like typically insurance is looking at like safety risks in the here and now. And what they would call the least restrictive level of care needed in order to provide safe and adequate care for that person. So a lot of times they're looking more at things like suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, or if a person becomes like gravely disabled, like unable to care for themselves. But the diagnosis in and of itself might not be enough to justify, from an insurance perspective, justify treatment. Although as a clinician, I would say it does.
Yeah, there is that gap often.
Yeah.
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 So Clay, when you and I were talking about you coming on and us making this show, even though you have experienced many symptoms for many years, you said that you still questioned at times if the DID diagnosis is accurate. You talked about sometimes feeling like you have what you called imposter syndrome, and that you had noticed that in the DID communities that you're part of, that appears to be a common experience. So I'm wondering if you can talk some about why at times you feel like an imposter, and what do you think causes you to doubt yourself and your diagnosis that way?
I think this is a super important question, and there's a lot of layers to it. Every person I've spoken to that has DID also has questioned whether they have DID. And I think that partially the DID is formed out of a version of denial. Like there's a lot of parts that are created to help you survive awful trauma. So there's a lot of blocking of memories that happen with the parts as a protection mechanism. And for me, a huge part of my recovery has been simply believing myself that the trauma is real. And that's complicated too, because I mean, my first memories are like when I'm 2, and I get kind of like, how can I know that this thing happened when I was 2? It gets like really complicated for me. And then a lot of my abuse happened at night while I was sleeping. And so there's this other element of like, was it a dream? Was it real? Am I perverted? Like, yeah. So I've had a lot of confusion inside myself. I also experience a lot of derealization when I'm dissociating, which is losing a sense of like what's reality and what's not. And so I'm constantly questioning, like, is this real? What is real? How do I know what's real? And like especially experiencing body memories too. It's like my body is going through something that is clearly not happening in this moment. So how can my brain decipher what is real and what is not? So I experience a lot of imposter syndrome. I don't know if my trauma is real, and I often like get into, I have parts that get into a lot of self-punishment because they think I'm a bad person or I'm awful, or how could I even say these things against, I mean, for me, my trauma happened from my parents. So like, how could I betray them by saying this? And um, yeah, so I question that. And with DID, I told you there was that part early on, especially that I thought that I should have more control over what was happening. And I still often feel that way. Like, I'm like, am I making this up? Am I just like, do I have horrible impulse control? Like, what is happening? And how come I cannot control what my body is doing right now, especially if I'm present? Like, I have a lot of presence and awareness inside myself while I'm dissociating. Like, I am in the back seat, I am watching it. And so I feel like I should be able to control it too.
That is a complex response. I can see that. I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And the next question I was going to ask you was about, understanding that recovery is an ongoing process. And I'm wondering, up to this point in time, what would you describe as some of the most important contributions or turning points in your own mental health recovery?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned earlier that I was like over exercising and overworking a lot. And I ended up having a series of very unfortunate events. It was like 3 years of constant awful things happening. And like the last two things that happened was I was electrocuted by lightning, and then I accidentally cut my finger off. And after that, it was kind of like I felt like I got broken in the way that I needed to. Like, it was the shift that I needed to actually stop and work on myself. And in a lot of ways, I was truly broken. Like, I was having 12 hours a day of like nonstop trauma responses. I was crying and shaking. I couldn't walk outside and experience light or sound without totally like convulsing, like shaking and crying. But it really gave me the opportunity to go inward. I got on disability. I went to a few different treatment centers, and really like my full-time job became working on myself. So I can look at that experience as like, this thing was horrible and it was awful that it happened, but in reality it gave me the opportunity to heal that I really needed. And I'm not recovered yet. I still have a really long way to go with my journey, and I'm still experiencing a lot of symptoms and a lot of struggle. But I'm not where I was a few years ago. There has been change, but I think it's needed a lot of persistence, and it's needed a lot of trying different modalities. Like, I've tried probably almost every type of therapy there is. And all of them have contributed in some way.
I'm secretly hoping that part of your recovery has been to be a little more compassionate with yourself and a little more accepting, that you brought up the imposter syndrome, and even just being willing to say that you have it, to me, is a step up outside of it in a way, just like watching that happens for you and hoping that you can be like, well, this is just part of what it does. You know, anyway, that's
Yeah.
my hope, that that's part of your recovery.
Thank you. That's a piece that I'm still really working on. And like, this podcast even is a huge step for me, because before in my life, I think there were like maybe 5 people that knew I had DID. And I'm really hoping that like sharing more about it and kind of helping people have more awareness and understanding can help kind of even shift my own stigma that I have towards this diagnosis.
What would you say some of the most difficult challenges you've run into in your recovery process have been? And have you overcome some of those? And if so, how?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of pieces to that. I think in my own personal journey, the denial piece has been really big and also like layered. Like I feel like I've reached points in my life where I'm like, no, this is real. I'm not making it up. And then like somehow the onion gets like peeled back, and then like there's a new layer of like, oh man, I have to really reckon again with the fact that this is real. And I just really easily go into these cycles. I mean, I have this internal war. I have parts that constantly are trying to remind me that this was real, and then I have parts that are constantly blaming me and telling me I'm wrong because it's made up. And so there's just this nonstop fight, and no one is willing to like find a compromise. Everyone is like, no, this is my absolute truth, and this is what you need to believe. And then it causes them all to not trust me because every part is like, well, you're trying to do something different than what I want. And so, and they're young, like most of my parts are very young, and so it's not like speaking to a rational adult. I also think a huge struggle is like financial. I mean, it is so expensive to go to therapy, and I feel like probably like anything I haven't spent on food and shelter has been spent on trying to get treatment and hope.
Clay, you also told me that many DID treatment approaches that you've experienced have had this idea of integration of the parts as the goal, but you said that you're finding through your own experience with internal family systems work that it was more like cohesion that's important. And I'm wondering if you could describe what you mean by that distinction, and what are you learning about this for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of a particular trigger around the word integration, because historically DID has been extremely misunderstood, and it used to be called multiple personality disorder before they, it was just this belief that people were crazy and they like acted in parts, and that the answer was integration and getting rid of the parts to become one person again. And so I personally like to use the word cohesion because it feels more connective. It feels like we're using this adaptive coping mechanism to help like create a more whole person. And it's not that we're getting rid of the parts, but it's that we're helping the parts work together and realize that they're on the same team. So yeah, I don't like integration because it feels really threatening to my parts. They're like, what, you want to get rid of me? Like, no, I'm real. And so cohesion just feels like, no, let's work together. Like, I want to know you, I want to understand you, and I want to be grateful for the ways that you've helped me. But how can we like work together in a more functional and positive way?
You're listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm Deborah Sloss, your host, and today we're talking about dissociative identity disorder, or DID, which is one of the most misunderstood of all psychiatric conditions. We're hoping this conversation will help to spread greater understanding and address common misconceptions. Joining us for this conversation is Clay Whitten, who lives with DID and has recently been tremendously helped by the internal family systems therapeutic model. Also with us is clinical psychologist and leader of the Wings Recovery Trauma Treatment Program, Dr. Alisa Brady. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and the resources we talk about today and more can be found in the show notes for this episode. You can also listen or subscribe to our podcast on all the major sites and on your home smart speaker. Show notes, resources, our podcasts, and where to subscribe to them can all be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Now, back to our interview. Alisa, I want to come back to you because Clay was just talking about their experience with the internal family systems model of working with these many parts. And I'm wondering, I know that you integrate the internal family systems model into your work with DID patients. And I'm wondering if you can talk some about how this therapy works and why is it particularly helpful for DID treatment?
Sure. So at the core of internal family systems, or IFS, is a work towards cooperation and collaboration between the parts of the self. And Clay was talking earlier about integration and kind of that term as being something that is threatening. And I agree, because I think when I first started working, or earlier on when I was working with individuals with DID and dissociation, we would use the term integration, not meaning that any part had to go away, but realize over time that that is common for people to have a reaction to that term in particular. And it makes sense. And in part of the IFS approach is that there's no part that is not welcome, that every part of the self is welcome. That we're never trying to get rid of any part, but instead working towards cooperation and collaboration, communication, co-consciousness between the parts. And so it's really a way to explore and get to understand the different parts of the self. And I also want to mention that, IFS is not just used with individuals who have dissociation or DID, but it can be used with many different conditions or issues that you may be dealing with. In fact, it was initially developed as a way to treat eating disorders, which I think is interesting. But I think a lot of people can benefit from an internal family systems approach to working through issues in therapy.
Could you give a brief overview of what that approach is?
Sure. It's so hard to kind of break it down into its basic level, but essentially, it's identifying parts of the self and facilitating communication between the parts of the self. So almost imagine that if you were doing family therapy and you have multiple people in the room, and your goal in that family therapy session is to help, not to get rid of a family member or to have somebody leave the family system, but to work among all members of that family in that therapy session. You would be trying to get them to communicate, see each other's perspectives, collaborate, communicate, have an awareness, and listen to each other respectfully, right? Those kind of things. So that's kind of, you're doing that work, but within one individual. So that one individual, you're helping facilitate them understand the parts of themselves, communicate with that part of themselves, recognize that they're there, to communicate with them respectfully, and to create that cooperation and cohesion amongst those different parts of the self.
You also told me when we were talking that you believe in both a bottom-up and a top-down approach, and that both are needed in treating dissociative identity disorder. So can you describe what those two approaches are, and why do you think both are important?
Yeah, this is really an approach not just for dissociative identity disorder, but PTSD and trauma and other conditions. But my belief is that the best way to help someone heal is a top-down and a bottom-up approach, meaning that the top-down approach is the basic skills. What are the skills I'm going to use? It's maybe the CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, or the dialectical behavior therapy, or other skills that you're grounding techniques, things that the individual can use to cope, or try to use those skills to cope in the moment, right? And then the bottom-up approach is the deeper part of the work where you're reprocessing or working through trauma memories so that the trauma memories no longer have the same impact on that person. And I think if you do just one or the other, you may be missing out, right? So if you're just doing a top-down approach and you're just teaching skills, well, great, this person is using skills, but there's going to be times when those skills don't work or are not working as well. And it's more kind of a Band-Aid approach, right? Whereas, if you're just doing a bottom-up approach and you're just reprocessing without teaching somebody skills, you're leaving them raw and vulnerable, because now you're reprocessing trauma and they haven't learned like tools that work for them to manage extreme emotions or to manage dissociation or to manage interpersonal conflicts or things that come up. So I think it really needs to be both and simultaneously, hopefully, to be able to do both and revisiting so that you have a fluid approach to being like, okay, we're working on skills and we're also working on processing memories, and to have a fluid approach to using both of those techniques to help somebody.
Alisa, what are some of the most common misconceptions about dissociative identity disorder, and what would you want professionals or laypersons to know to address these?
I think that dissociative identity disorder can present in many different ways. Just as we as human beings are so unique, the presentation of the condition can be unique as well. That it's not always a dramatic presentation. In fact, sometimes if there's a very dramatic presentation, it could be something else. So paying attention to that. And I think another misconception would just be just how hard it is. I'm sure we could all imagine just how hard it is on individuals to come to terms with the diagnosis. I think it's very common that individuals will be like in denial about it or not wanting to really accept the diagnosis early on, especially if there's dissociative fugue, that a lot of times individuals will minimize like the memory lapses or kind of play it off a bit. And so that is normal. And also just realizing individuals with dissociative identity disorder really, really can suffer a great, great deal. And because of that, there's often a lot of suicidal ideation. Attempted suicide is not uncommon. And just having patience with those individuals, I think, as they work through that process. And knowing that it's also very common for individuals with trauma, but also in particularly individuals with dissociation or DID, that they often question whether that diagnosis is real for them. That's really very common.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think it's true that we do have stigma even within our own mental health system that creates barriers and obstacles for people. So I'm appreciating that you pointed that out. Alisa, what are some of the most important things you think listeners should know if they have a loved one diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or perhaps they're concerned for a loved one's mental health and wonder if they might have this condition?
I think patience, I think it's going to require patience and acknowledging that that individual may not recognize it or want to believe it. I think it's important not to challenge it too straight on, but allow them to find their own path and figuring out for themselves. Like, it really is something that I think individuals need to self-diagnose in some ways. It requires that like ability to see it within themselves and to do the work. And it can take quite a while to come to the conclusion that that is a diagnosis that fits for somebody.
I think also believing them. Like if somebody says it, like not deny, like I've had people be like, no, you don't have that. I'm like, okay, that doesn't help me.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point.
So, Alisa, are there resources you'd want to share with listeners related to dissociative identity disorder that could be helpful?
Sure. I mean, for practitioners, I would say the work of Dolores Mosquera has been, for me, some of the most helpful. Um, she's in, she's actually located in Spain, but she does a lot of EMDR integrated with IFS, and she's brilliant. So I think that's a great resource, is looking into some of the books and some of the trainings by Dolores Mosquera. For skill-based trauma coping, I would say Coping with Trauma-Related Dissociation is a book that I've really found useful. Treatment programs, the program that I'd started, Wings Recovery, we work with DID and dissociation and PTSD. There's others out there that you can look into, that you want to make sure that the treatment center you're looking into really does specialize in treatment of DID, and that they have experience in treating DID and trauma, because some treatment centers will say that they do, but they don't necessarily. Making sure that you have the right treatment center and right clinician is important. And I think NAMI is also a good resource for family members and individuals with DID.
NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and there are both at a national level, there's an excellent website. At every state has a NAMI that has another level of resources and information, and frequently communities will have a chapter in their own community. We have a very active one here in Santa Cruz County. What about you, Clay? What dissociative identity disorder related resources have you found to be valuable on your own recovery journey?
Yeah, I was also going to mention NAMI, because NAMI also just has a lot of resources in general. When you go to their website, it can really help get access to a lot more support. So yeah, NAMI has been really, really big for me. There's also a movie. It was actually a student documentary that was made. It's only about 15 minutes long, and it's called Petals of a Rose. And it's like the best summary that I've ever been able to, or that I've ever witnessed, that can help people understand on a deeper level what it is like to have DID and maybe why it exists. So it's a great tool for like coming out, so to speak. I recently showed it to a lot of people in my life, and it's been a really helpful tool to kind of share this side of myself. And another website is Multiplied by One. It's a really cool website that has a lot of resources for DID specific, including like different podcasts, but they also have almost every day of the week different support groups. So it's a great way to speak to other people that have DID or other dissociated related symptoms. And they also have supporters groups too. So that's a really rich resource.
Wonderful. So, Alisa, what would you see as the most important first few steps for a person who's just newly diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder?
The first step is to find a therapist that you can trust, and a therapist who has experience, hopefully, with DID and dissociation. I think that building that trusting therapeutic relationship is probably the very first step to working through.
And Clay, what last few things would you want to share with our listeners? Perhaps these are key points that you want to leave them with, or maybe there's something that you wish you'd understood earlier in your own recovery process.
Yeah, I think first I'd like to share that like it can be really, really scary to get support, but getting the right support makes all the difference in the world. And it might not come with like the first attempt. Sometimes like the first people that you ask like might not be able to help support you in the way that you need. And it's not from like a lack of caring or anything, but like it's just there's not a lot of information. So yeah, getting support and being persistent with it, I think, is really important. I also really want to caution people about like diagnoses, because I think it could be really easy to get lost in a rabbit hole of like, is this what I have? Or like, yeah, like over identifying or like over analyzing themselves. And I think that And also there's like a lot of people that are like, I need an official diagnosis. And I don't think that that actually makes a huge difference. If anything, it just like adds more stigma to your like medical history or like getting support. So I think that like using the diagnoses to understand yourself can be really helpful, to like use the language to be like, oh, this is what's happening inside of me. But know that like if there's like, if you're looking at the DSM definition and there's like one or two points that you're like, well, actually that's not me, so maybe I don't have this, like that isn't helpful. Like everyone has a unique experience. And yeah, so I think not obsessing over a diagnosis can be really healthy. And I also just want people to know that they're not alone and they're not crazy. I think that that's a fear I often have, but like often the mental illness that people are experiencing are a direct result of something that they've been through. So instead of asking like, what's wrong with me, it's more helpful to be like, what happened that is leading to what's occurring right now.
You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Clay Whitten and Dr. Alisa Brady. And thanks to you for joining us. I encourage you to check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. New episodes of State of Mind, exploring mental health and wellness, are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzakowski for audio production and to Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was originally developed and broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.